Want to welcome you this morning. My name is Allison Arnold. I'm the Extension Agent here in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. We'll be making time throughout the program for questions and invite you to put your questions in the chat box. Welcome to Gardening in the Mountains, Bountiful Backyard Berries. I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Meghan Baker. Meghan Baker is an outreach educator with North Carolina Cooperative Extension, assisting small diversified farms in the Buncombe County region. Known for her expertise on a broad variety of plant crops, she balances production information with the larger realm of ecological stewardship. As a certified environmental educator and certified interpretive guide, Meghan relishes any opportunity to share her love of nature with others. Take it away, Meghan.
Welcome, everyone, and good morning. I'm excited to be with you this morning talking about berries. We are going to cover a lot of different types this morning, and so I'm going to pause after each fruit section, and Allison's going to help me monitor any questions that you may have. So we will dive in. We are going to talk about how to maximize growing fruit for the backyard and the home scale this morning. This is definitely the beginner level that we'll start at. And certainly, if we've got more involved questions, we can dive into those later as well. But in general, we want to think about how do we optimize success in yields and fruit bounty when we are talking about raising fruit in our backyard. Some key rules, no matter what type of fruit you're talking about, we want to make sure that we choose a good site, right? And we'll dive into a little bit more detail on each of these components, but we have to have a good site. We have to make sure that we have varieties that are suited well for Western North Carolina. There are endless varieties in the fruit catalogs and the online catalogs, and it can be super enticing to go after all the fun colors and names and shapes of fruit. But we really want to make sure you're choosing things that will thrive and do well here in our variable mountain that we've gotten some awakenings about recently. We also need to make sure we give them adequate space. So the good thing about most of these berries is they don't have to have a huge amount of space compared to the commercial operation. Each one of the plant types that we'll talk about has specific requirements for spacing, and we'll go into that in more detail. It's also tempting and in some cases appropriate to make your fruit plantings part of your general landscape. So looking at it with an aesthetic in mind. But we want to make sure that we don't blend fruit types together that have very different growing requirements. For example, blueberries have vastly different requirements than raspberries and blackberries and strawberries. So we want to make sure that we group those separately so that they can all thrive in their own way. For the backyard gardener too, you've got some flexibility on how you get water to these plants, but we want to make sure that you do have some plan in mind, whether that's soaker hose or drip irrigation or a commitment to getting out there and using your watering hose and having some zen watering time in the garden. All fruits, in order to get plump and really good flavor development, have to have adequate water during fruiting. That's a really important piece. Lastly, maybe you have a new home site that has been heavily trampled with machinery, or maybe your soil just is not ideal. You also want to think about utilizing raised beds, and we can go a little bit more in detail. The two pictures that you see there are two examples of raised beds that you could consider for growing fruit. More specifically, what are we looking for with a site that's going to yield happy fruit and a lot of it, hopefully? The biggest thing is sun. Lots of references will say that you need a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of sunshine, and that is absolutely accurate. The more sun that you get, the more yield ultimately you'll get as well. If you've got a site that has 12 hours of sun, all the better. But you really want to try to select an area that has at least 8 hours of full sun to get really good fruit yield. You also want to pay attention to the exposure. What I mean by that is north, south, east, west. When we think about sun exposure, which I just said we want a lot of, we often think about south-facing slopes that get sun all day long. South-facing slopes and east-facing slopes are 100% appropriate for growing fruit because they tend to warm up earlier in the day and get lots of sunshine. So that's not to say that you can't make a western or a north-facing slope work, but you're going to have more of a challenge. You might get more cold injury, or you might get more drought symptoms if we do have a dry year. Just things to think about with your exposure, and every site's going to be a little bit different. Related to that exposure and the sunshine, we also want to look at the site and try to envision how two things move on that site. We want to think about how air moves and how water moves. In that top picture, you can see that's clearly a mountain farm where we've got quite a slope. That's actually a high density apple orchard. And the reason I put that picture up there is I want you to notice that if you can think about how water is going to drain from the top of that field down to the bottom, that's also exactly how air moves. Where that comes into play a role with fruit production is when we have really erratic springs like we're having this year. When we have those cold weather events, the cold air is going to settle at the bottom of that slope. So if you site all of your fruit at the bottom of that slope, it's likely that you're going to have more freeze and frost injury. So you want to think about not planting at the very bottom of the slope, but planting at mid slope or closer to the top so that you can get some good air drainage as well as water drainage. Some of you may be perched on top of a mountain with your backyards. And if you have a really exposed site, you do want to think about siting your berries where they can get some wind protection. You'll hear me say later on that one of the ways that you can reduce pest pressure is to increase air circulation, but there can certainly be too much wind load and too much air circulation. If you've got fragile berries and the wind is going to get really dramatic, that can impact your yield and damage some of your fruit plants. So pay attention to those pieces of your site as well. Lastly, if you have trees on your property, which hopefully you do, you want to site most of your fruits away from those trees. The biggest reason is that those large root systems that trees have will outcompete a small blueberry bush or a small raspberry bush. You want to give adequate space from any kind of large forest line or shade tree in your yard. It'll also provide some shade, which can limit your fruit production. But the biggest piece with that is the competition from the root system. Looking at your site, you want to evaluate all of those parameters, and very few sites are ideal with every one of those considerations. Keep those in mind as you're looking at your property and where to plant. What about the soil? As gardeners, we always have to keep our first focus on the soil condition. First off, we need well-drained soils. Most of our soils have clay components, which might mean that it's less drained than ideal, and that's where those raised beds can come in handy. That bottom picture that you see there, if you look closely, you can see that those are blueberry bushes that haven't leafed out yet. They are actually planted on a raised mound that is made up of organic matter, so compost and shredded mulch. Over time, that material decomposes and enriches the soil microorganisms and also helps build up better soil conditions than that native soil may provide. Think about raised beds if your site warrants. But if you're lucky and you've got good draining soil, the next thing you want to focus on is your pH. If you've ever attended any extension event, you have heard all of us preach about soil testing. It's a free service for most of the year, and it helps you get an idea about what your pH levels and your nutrient levels are in your soil. As I mentioned earlier, blueberries, among all the other berries we'll talk about, have very different requirements for pH. They need acidic soils, and our mountain soils are naturally acidic, so they tend to be pretty happy. But for all of the other fruit types, you will likely need to add lime to raise that pH. And where that pH comes in handy is when you have soil pH in the ideal parameters, then that means that all those soil nutrients are more available to your plant. If your pH is out of whack, then it throws everything else out of whack. That's why we really pay close attention to that pH level. When you do your soil test, it will also give you information about what the phosphorus levels, and potassium levels, and other macronutrients are in your soil. Anything that fruits, every single plant we're going to talk about this morning needs a decent level of phosphorus in the soil. Phosphorus is the element that is directly tied to fruiting and flower production and fruiting, I should say. Most of our native soils are low, very low in phosphorus. Oftentimes, that's something that you need to add prior to planting because phosphorus moves really slowly through the soil profile. Doing a soil test, getting a gauge on where your nutrient levels are can give you time to put those needed materials down and have happy plants and healthy plants. Now, there are some sites where, let's say you've got a site that was an old vegetable garden and you want to plant blueberries there. Blueberries, as I mentioned, like acidic soils, they don't like pH levels in the 6.5 and 7. So there are some considerations where you might have to add elemental sulfur, which is a material that will draw down the pH. So it works in the exact opposite way that liming works. But again, you're not going to know any of that unless you do a soil test. So please do a soil test. The other thing you want to make sure to do is to control weeds at the site before you put plants in the ground. And I guarantee all gardeners, all plant people have gone to a nursery, seen some plants, just been overtaken by them and purchase them, bring them home, and you're ready to plant. You've not done a lot of site preparation before planting. While that's less ideal, you can still make that work. The key thing is to try to reduce the weed pressure when you are looking at planting, especially things like blueberries and caneberries that can live for decades. You want to make sure that you start out with a really clean site, meaning that you want very little weed pressure. So if you're planting into a lawn area, you remove a lot of that turf where you're going to be planting those fruit plants. And that gets back to competition, right? You've got weeds, you've got turf that can compete with your very fragile fruit plant roots, and they can often overpower. Take care of your soil and assess it well before you actually plant your fruit plants into the ground. Note about varieties. I know we have a lot of folks on this call this morning, and I'm not sure where everyone is based, but in Western North Carolina, we have a wide range of growing zones. The plant hardiness map that the USDA puts out, we can largely think about the areas in Western North Carolina falling somewhat between the growing zones of 7 up to 5B. That includes everything from the bottom fields and the valleys up to the really high elevation peaks that some of you might be on. You want to focus on varieties that can tolerate those climatic conditions. Because if you pick a variety that is quite happy in New Mexico and you move it to Western North Carolina, you might find that it suffers from spring frosts or it doesn't fruit well. You really want to pay attention to the varieties. I've listed several varieties when we go into each of the fruit types. So you'll see those as well. That chilling hours is more appropriate if you're thinking about growing tree fruit. In our area, you want to try to select fruit types that require a minimum of 750 chilling hours for Western North Carolina. Pay attention to your climate. On every site, there are microclimates. So something that's closer to a structure is going to be a little bit more protected. Something that's on the crest of a hill is going to be a little bit more exposed. Just try to pay attention to those patterns at your site so that you know where the more protected areas are that you can hopefully grow fruits with success. When we're talking about fruit, if you are taking advantage of any of the fruit plant sales that are happening in the spring, you will likely come across plants that are in containers and plants that are bare root. Most of the mail order catalogs, if you're getting fruit trees or different types of other fruit varieties, oftentimes you'll see those as bare root. And so they are shipped to your home with roots that are exposed. That means that you have to be really careful about handling those plants and getting them into the ground very quickly because those roots can dry out. If those roots dry out, then that entire plant ends up being dead. Bare roots are very adaptable when you're trying to look for specific varieties that might be harder to find. Oftentimes, finding those varieties in a bare root form is easier than finding them in a container. But just know that you need to have a plan in place to get those plants in the ground as soon as possible if you do have bare root material. Containerized plants offer much more flexibility. You can always take a bare root plant and pot it up if you do run into a situation where you can't get things in the native ground in time. But containerized plants are also very adaptable. Oftentimes, they'll be a little bit more limited in the types of varieties that you can find, but that's not always the case. The biggest thing to pay attention to is that if you are buying containerized plants, just like any plant that you're buying, take a look at the root system. So you can actually you can squeeze the pot and lift that root system out and check to see if the roots have been root bound, if it's been in the container too long. Oftentimes you'll see a circling of the roots. And that's just going to help you gauge the quality of the plant and if it's a plant that you actually should end up buying or not. Oftentimes, if we are buying things at the tail end of the season in the fall, containerized plants that have been in there for months, sometimes will have root systems that need to be pruned back in order to make sure that they grow properly once they're in the native soil. Now we're going to dive into all of the fruit types. And as I mentioned, we'll stop, and after each section, strawberries will be our first one. I'll stop and see if we've got questions that we can address. We're going to kick off with strawberries, which in my opinion are probably the best fruit to start with if you're a beginning grower. The reason being that you can grow them in a wide variety of containers, and you can grow them even if you don't have a yard. You can grow them in a very small space. They're pretty consistent producers. They're almost instant gratification, where you can get a lot of fruit in a short period of time. And they are self-fruitful. What that means is that many of the other fruit types that we'll talk about, you need to have more than one variety so that you get adequate cross-pollination. But because strawberries are self-fruitful, you can just go to the nursery and buy a bundle of 25 Chandler variety, for example. And you can go ahead and just plant those right in your ground and get started growing strawberries. Now, all of the fruit types that we talk about today are perennial, but strawberries, they're not as long-lived as some of the other plants that we'll talk about. The reason we suggest that you replace those plants after about 3 years is due to disease pressure that can build up in your soil. Just know that every 2, 3, 4 years, you're going to be replacing those plants so that you can keep disease pressure to a minimum. Strawberries fall into two main categories when you're looking at the varieties. And the more traditional varieties are the June bearing. These are the plants that fruit heavily in the spring and late spring. Most of the plants that you purchase in the nursery this time of year are June bearing, not always, so pay attention to that. Essentially, June bearing plants are triggered by shorter day length to flower, and they will produce one massive crop in the spring, and then they're done for the rest of the year producing fruit. It's a personal preference, but a lot of folks feel that the June bearing varieties have more flavor, a little bit more complex flavor profile, although that's personal choice. But the June bearing plants you will see are vastly different than what we call everbearing strawberry plants. Everbearing plants, rather than having one huge yield or one huge harvest window, actually will fruit throughout the summertime. So you'll get a little bit of fruit for a longer period of time. They also grow really differently. So everbearing plants stay more contained so they don't sprawl out with runners to the extent that June bearing plants do. The graphic that you see there on the slide just shows you that with day neutral or everbearing plants, and those two terms mean the same thing, you can plant them closer together because they don't sprawl out as much. That also means that if you've got a small amount of space or you're doing containerized gardens, you do want to focus on the everbearing or the day neutral varieties. We'll look at that a little bit more as well in the next few slides. Again, we've got the June bearing and the everbearing varieties. Depending on which one of those you go with, most home gardeners are quite happy with the June bearing varieties, but you could have a mix of both. There are different planting systems depending on the varieties that you have. For example, the commercial growers that I work with that raise strawberries often are using day neutral or the everbearing varieties, and they're growing them on plastic that you can see in the bottom picture there. And you might be able to tell those individual plants are planted closely together, and they don't have a lot of runners or daughter plants that are sprouting off from the main mother plant. In a commercial setting, those plants are planted in the fall, and then they produce the next year. Then all of those plants are pulled out of the field and replaced every year. Again, that's for disease pressure and disease control. For the home gardener, you can think about doing containers, as I mentioned, and there's a variety of different types of containers out there. There's actual strawberry planters, there's strawberry pyramid plants that you've likely seen. All of those are appropriate for the everbearing varieties. But for the June-bearing varieties, there is something called the matted row system. And the graphic that you see there on the right basically shows you what that is. The matted row system essentially encourages those individual plants to send out runners. And then those individual runners create new plants, so that eventually you are filling out two bands of strawberry plants. That means that you're going to get a lot of yield, and it can be easy to get in there and harvest and clearly see where the plants are. So for most home gardeners, I would say go with matted row or containers. No matter what type of strawberry you have, just a graphic to show you that strawberry plants are a little bit different than most of the other plants that we see, and they have a very compressed stem. And that stem needs to be planted appropriately at the soil level. You can make the mistake of planting that too deep. If you plant the stem too deep in the soil, you will have a dead plant in a few days or weeks. If you don't plant the roots deep enough, then they will be exposed and they'll dry out, and that plant will also end up dead. You want to make sure that you site that stem just above the soil line, making sure that you're keeping all the root below ground in the soil. Strawberries are very easy to grow. Like all of the plants that we'll talk about, they need fertilization at regular intervals. All of these plants are going to need fertilizing at planting or just before planting so that they can get a good start and have adequate nutrition to get leaves growing and roots growing. Of course, strawberries get their name from covering them with straw, which helps basically keep them protected when we do have winter temperatures. This time of year is when we start to, especially the past few weeks where we've gotten ridiculously warm in a quick period of time, those row covers can be removed when we have warm temperature. But in the spring, especially in the mountains where we have this erratic back and forth, you want to have something on hand that you can cover those plants back up if we do have a cold spell. That can be mulch, that can be straw needles or pine needles, or it can be floating row cover, which is what you see in the bottom picture there. And that basically just gives a level of air insulation from the cold temperatures. Strawberries, like all of the fruits, need to be watered. You need to make sure that you've got some sort of irrigation in place. Soaker hoses are a very easy thing for home gardeners to access. And especially when the fruit is starting to form, that's when you want to make sure you've got adequate water getting to those plants. And as a general rule, an inch of water per week is what every plant wants to be able to really thrive and produce healthy and juicy fruit. As I mentioned, matted row is what we largely recommend for home gardeners. The image that you see there, over time, each of those individual plants sends out runners. That is what those June-bearing varieties do. They just send out runners and more daughter plants. What happens over time is that if you don't maintain that spacing, all those plants form a very dense mat that is impossible to manage well, and it's a ripe situation for disease pressure. You want to make sure that you are going in and cultivating those matted row strawberries. At the end of a productive season, you may need to go in and renovate that bed. And I'll show you what that looks like. Essentially, you've got a large band of strawberry plants, and after they have fruited, if the planting has gotten really dense and overgrown, you can go in and renovate that planting. And essentially, you're making a pass with a lawnmower or clippers and removing all of those plant tops, so all of the leaves. You're leaving the stems in place. You don't want to damage those, but you're basically removing all of that foliage and then coming back in and cultivating back down to about that 18-inch band of plants that you want rather than 3 feet. Strawberry plantings can be really vigorous and get out of control. If that does happen, just know that you can renovate that. You can mow those leaves down. You can cultivate and then fertilize and water and rejuvenate that planting. That's a really good thing to do to minimize disease pressure because any of these soil-borne diseases that affect strawberries, if they start in a site, can oftentimes be impossible to eradicate from the soil. So be as cautious with that as you can be. Before I move on to caneberries, Allison, can you let me know if there's any strawberry questions?
Yeah, Megan, we have a couple. One is about ants and then also critters. One specifically about ants, how to keep ants off strawberries, and then also about critters in general.
So ants, I'm assuming you're meaning getting on the fruits as they're ripening. One of the things that you can do is the bait traps. I do have folks that have had success using the borax bait traps. If you do have an ant population that's a little bit too robust, you can use those around the strawberries and hopefully take down their population that way. But the reality is that fruits are really enticing to us and to lots of other insects. And so that's just going to be something that you'll likely have to manage.
And that would go the same for slugs.
Yes, the caveat of anytime you're using mulch, you're also creating a situation where you might have slugs. If you do have heavy slug pressure, there are products that you can buy. Sluggo is one brand name that you can use to keep their populations down. I've never had really great luck with the beer traps that you can find, but some people have. I also know folks that will put wooden boards in the walkway and the slugs will accumulate under there. And then you can just move those boards. And if you've got chickens or ducks, you can feed the slugs to your fowl. But that is something that you will want to monitor, especially if you do have a heavy mulch layer.
Question: would you pull the mother strawberry plants every 3 years, but keep their daughters for the next 3 years?
Generally, yes. It's the mother plants that are aging out, and they will be oftentimes the ones that you'll start to see foliar spots on leaves that are starting to build up disease problems. So it's those young, rejuvenated daughter plants. Oftentimes, that's what people give to their neighbors to start new plantings. The young plants are what you want to keep going in your garden.
If disease pressure is building up and you're rotating, what should not be planted behind there? Like if you're moving strawberries out.
It depends on what the disease pathogen is. I will say there is a particular pathogen, I believe it's verticillium wilt, that if you've had nightshades growing and you've had verticillium issues with your nightshades, if you move strawberries into that same site, you can also create disease problems with your strawberries. I imagine that inverse would be true. If you've got verticillium in your strawberries, you don't want to come back and plant nightshades after that. But it really all depends on the type of pathogen you're dealing with.
You mentioned June berries in containers. Are they better in containers or matted rows?
Matted rows, the everbearing or the day neutral are the ones that are really good for containers. So caneberries. Caneberries covers blackberries and raspberries, and they are very adaptable. Also a really good fruit plant to start with. They are very vigorous and they can be a little confusing for the first time grower because they have two types of canes. One type is called a primocane. That is developed in the first year of growth. And that primocane will mature the second year into a floricane. The floricanes is where that fruit is produced. You will hear those terms, primocane and floricane. After they have produced fruit, they are no longer productive and they will die. We talk about these caneberries as having a biennial growth system where they've got the first year of the primocane growth and the second year of the floricane growth. So just know that those are two terms that we'll talk about again. Caneberries in general are quite happy with pH between the 6 and 7 range. They like adequate soil nutrition, like all of these plants we've talked about. They do have shallow roots. And so much like strawberries, we want to make sure we're mulching them adequately. We're irrigating them when they've got fruits forming. The biggest piece with caneberries is because they are so vigorous, you have got to make sure you're pruning them. Periodically throughout the growing season, those plants are sending up lots of canes. And if you don't prune those, you can create disease pressure and it can be really difficult to get in there and actually harvest the fruit that's there to begin with. So we'll go into pruning in a little bit more detail. Focusing first on blackberries. Blackberries are probably the most adaptive fruit that we would encourage you to grow in the garden. They can grow almost anywhere and they can be pretty long lived. They oftentimes have a weedy tendency, meaning that they can get out of control, which is where that pruning piece comes in that we'll talk about more. There's 3 different growth types of blackberries. There's erect, semi-erect, and trailing. You generally will not see recommendations for any trailing varieties because they require a trellis system and they can just be harder to maintain and harvest. So most of the varieties you'll see that we recommend fall into the erect category or the semi-erect category. The other thing about blackberries that's a little bit more attractive is that they tend to bloom after most of our spring freezes. That's not always true, and this year it may not be true. But compared to other fruits, oftentimes blackberries are a little bit more tolerant because their blooms come out later, so they're not as susceptible to frost damage. So, some different varieties. We have erect and semi erect varieties that we recommend. Whether it's an erect or semi erect type, I do recommend having some sort of trellis system, even for the erect varieties. And that is because you want to keep that fruit up off the ground where other things can feed on that fruit, where rots can start, and you want to get adequate air and light flow into that canopy. So, trellising any of these varieties would be recommended. The erect floricane fruiting varieties that are in yellow, those are the ones that are just far outranking all of the others as far as taste and productivity. But as a home gardener, you've got the option to experiment with any of these varieties. Now, one of the things that you'll see in blackberries and raspberries is the term primocane fruiting. That can be a little confusing. As I mentioned, primocanes grow the first year, and in most of the varieties, it's the floricanes that produce the fruit the second season. However, because plant breeders are always looking at ways of introducing new fruits and new fruit types, there have been primocane fruiting varieties developed. And the reason I'm mentioning that is primocane fruiting varieties fruit off the tips of those first year primocanes. And because they do that, it means that your pruning chores for the winter are much easier. So, primocane fruiting varieties are just easier to maintain, but we'll talk about floricane, how you would prune those, and you can make the decision for yourself which varieties to go with. I want you to trellis all your blackberries and raspberries. There's a variety of different trellis types. There's T trellises and V trellises, and it's largely up to you and how you like to stage your system. Both provide really good support for the canes and the fruit to tie on and make harvesting much easier. Extension does have publications that tell you the type of wire and the spacing to use. As I mentioned, blackberries and raspberries do need to be pruned regularly. Most of the time, you're pruning in the dormant season in the winter, but in the summer, if you've got really vigorous plants, you can also cut their height back, and that helps you harvest easier. And it sends out more lateral growth. The lateral growth is where that fruit is born when we're talking about floricane fruiting varieties. In the wintertime, we're focusing on trying to minimize the number of canes that will be leafing out next season. If you have too many canes growing from one particular area, you're going to have congestion, you're going to have lack of airflow, lack of sunlight, and that leads to disease problems. So in the wintertime, the general rule of thumb is to reduce the number of canes to about 4 on each side of the trellis so that you've got a manageable amount of canes. And while it might seem that that's going to reduce the yield, it's actually going to ensure that you get healthier fruit and more robust fruit for the long haul. Pruning is very involved, and we don't have time to dive into all of it today, but NC State does have some really good pruning tutorials. Gina Fernandez is our fruit specialist, and she's got some great ones that I encourage you to check out to get a feel for how to prune these caneberries. Raspberries are a little less vigorous than blackberries, but certainly produce a lot of fruit, can live 5 to 10 years. And so, siting these guys appropriately and making sure you've done all your good soil prep really comes in handy here. There's a lot of different fruit types. The colors of the raspberries, there's lots of different varieties to go for. And in general, not always true, but in general, the purple and black varieties are a little bit more disease prone. Again, every site is a little bit different, and you can hedge your bets to improve that disease potential. But just know that that's kind of a general trend and why you might want to have a few of all types of those varieties. So again, we hear primocane and floricane when we're talking about cane berries. Raspberries, there's a lot of different primocane fruiting varieties. Again, that's meaning that that first year primocane is able to produce fruit. And the benefit to those is that rather than having to go in and have really involved, careful pruning at the end of the season, you can literally, with primocane fruiting varieties, take your lawnmower or take your clippers and just mow everything down. Get rid of those canes, burn them, and then let next season happen. You don't have to worry too much about picking through the floricanes and the primocanes. So there's different varieties that are primocane fruiting versus the floricane fruiting varieties that will take 2 years to produce. If you want to grow raspberries and you want to be a lazy gardener, like sometimes I like to be, the primocane varieties can be very useful. And in a commercial scale, the primocanes are a little bit easier to manage for commercial growers. They can be grown in high tunnels and managed more effectively and have good yields. This is an example of what it might look like in the dormant season if you've got a raspberry planting, and this would be if you've got floricane fruiting varieties. You can see that there's a lot of canes there, and we want to improve the light flow, improve the airflow, minimize those canes down to about 3 to 4 every foot or so, and really allow those canes to put out energy into those fruit buds coming for next year. And as I mentioned, if you're dealing with a primocane variety, then your pruning would be coming through and just clipping all of those down and burning all of those canes as a disease prevention step, and you're done. So, people that want to start with raspberries, if you've never grown them before, you might want to consider the primocanes because they just are a little bit easier to manage. Allison, I will check in to see if there's any raspberry questions or blackberry questions before we jump into blueberries.
We have a couple, Megan. One is, other than trellising, is there a reason you don't recommend trailing varieties?
They're just not as well suited for our area. The variety types that do well in our area are the semi-trailing and the erect varieties. The trailing varieties are much more finicky to manage as far as pruning and trellising goes.
Do you need more than one plant to fruit, or can you just have one plant of a bramble and do fine?
I would recommend getting more than one plant. You want to make sure that you've set yourself up for success. So get a few different varieties if possible, but definitely more than one plant so that you can get good cross pollination.
Thank you.
So, blueberries are pretty long lived perennial bushes. They can live 20 to 30 years. So, again, really pay attention to siting them properly. Most of our native soil is quite happy at a low pH to make blueberries really flourish. Blueberries are definitely one of the fruit types where you do need more than one cultivar. And that again gets back to cross pollination to make sure that you've got lots of blooms where the pollinators can come in and move the pollen around and ensure good fruit set. Blueberries are often accounted as being one of the small fruits that can take a little bit of shade. Raspberries can take some afternoon shade as well. But again, the more shade you have, the less fruit that you're going to have. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you look at old publications for Western North Carolina, you will see two types of blueberry varieties mentioned. You'll see northern highbush varieties and rabbit eye varieties. And in years past, we used to say, oh, you can't grow rabbit eye varieties in the mountains, only do northern highbush varieties. And that's Duke, Patriot, Blu-ray, Jersey, all of those at the bottom there. But because our climate's changing and because rabbit eye varieties are a little bit more adaptive to soil types, we certainly are recommending that people explore both varieties. Rabbit eye varieties, Climax, Premier, the varieties that you see listed for both high bush and rabbit eye are put in order of early to mid-season to late season. So Duke is an early season high bush variety. Croatan is a late season high bush variety, and so on for the rabbit eye varieties. Rabbit eye varieties grow bigger, they're larger bushes, and so you do need to alter the spacing a little bit, give the rabbit eyes more space than the high bush. But certainly you can plant both in our climate. Blueberries, all types, definitely like heavy organic matter. When they are grown, when they're found in their native environments, there's a lot of peat, there's a lot of organic matter in the soil. And so, again, by putting down mulch layers, making sure you're irrigating those plants, you can make sure that they're going to be very productive and long lived for you. You see the spacing difference there between the high bush. You can plant those 4 to 5 feet apart. And the rabbit eyes need more space. And I will tell you, I'm a short person. So the rabbit eye varieties can be difficult because they do get to be so large. So keep that in mind if you're wanting to keep a smaller sized plant or you have space limitations, then I would probably err on the side of getting a high bush variety over a rabbit eye variety. But you could certainly grow high bush varieties in containers if you don't have a larger area to put them in. Blueberries have to have acidic soil. And if we have too high a pH, then we can have issues with flowering and with how the leaves are able to photosynthesize and be healthy. The picture that you see there is what happens when we have too high a pH. It basically throws off the nutrient availability and the micronutrients within the plant. So if you have blueberries that are very off color, and just don't seem to be thriving, that's a time to check your pH. If your pH is too high, you can always come back in and add some sulfur to your soil, which will draw down that pH. Mulching, irrigating, pruning, all of those pieces will help you maintain healthy blueberries. If there's one rule that I can say most people get wrong is that most people think that they don't have to prune their blueberries every year. When in fact, pruning is a rejuvenating process and is actually a really important way to minimize disease pressure and ensure that you are maximizing the fruit buds on the bushes. What that might look like, we do have some publications, and on the next slide, there's another YouTube link to a pruning tutorial for blueberries. But essentially, you want to target the most robust canes or branches coming out of the soil. And while you're going to be removing some of those branches every year, and you might cry when you see the fruit buds that you're also removing, just know that the energy from that root system will be able to go a lot further and to create healthier berries on a smaller number of branches and canes than if you left a really mangled and numerous branched shrub. Because of time, we don't have a lot of flexibility to go into pruning, but there is a YouTube pruning tutorial that I would recommend. When you're out looking at your blueberries, if you've already got them on your site, pay attention to taking some observations at the branching structure. So I'm going to see if you can see my mouse cursor here. These stems on the right are ideal. They're thick, the buds are contained, whereas these side shoots are flimsy, they're very thin. Quality fruit is not going to be formed on these kinds of branches. That's what pruning helps us do, is to remove these weaker branches and concentrate that fruit growth so that we get really good fruit load and fruit set.
A couple of questions about Vaccinium angustifolia, the wild blueberry, having that in the home garden.
All vacciniums do well. So experiment with as many varieties as you have space for.
Remind us again about pruning blueberries. When is the best window for that? And are we too late right now?
Mm, We've had such an odd year. It's a little too late at this point. If you haven't done your blueberries yet, I would say do a quick look through. If you see diseased stems or something that looks like it's diseased, go ahead and target getting that out. or any dead branches, but pruning is a rejuvenating process. So we try to have people target that January, February window so that the plant is still dormant. You're pruning things out. And we usually have a span of time where we have not 80-degree weather in February, and that really wakes the plant up. And so if you prune now, the risk is that you're going to create new growth to come out earlier, and it could get damaged by spring frost. That every site's different though. I'm right in the heart of Asheville, and I would be cautious about pruning my bushes, but if I were at 4,500 elevation, you could go ahead and still do that.
Thank you.
Grapes are very adaptable. I would probably lump them on the side of the blackberry spectrum as far as being able to adapt to a wide range of sites and soil types. All grapes are vines, and so that means they are going to put out a prolific amount of growth. That means that you need to plan in advance how you're going to manage those grapevines, whether that's an arbor, whether that's a more traditional grapevine trellis. You're going to have to get those vines up off the ground so that you can have the fruit up off the ground. Now, grapes are self-fertile, so you can just have one variety, much like the strawberries that we talked about. But if you want to extend the types of jams or jellies or juices that you're growing, or if you're trying to get into wine production, certainly you'd want to be selecting more than one cultivar, because every site's going to allow certain cultivars to thrive and some to be less prolific. So keep that in mind as well. Now, there are muscadines that are grown down off the mountain with a high degree of success. And there are some intrepid mountain growers that are attempting to grow muscadines in the western part of the state. But generally, muscadines are not something that historically we have seen do really well in the mountains. But again, our climate is changing. And if you're a backyard producer, you've got the flexibility to experiment with a lot of different varieties. So this rule of not growing muscadines in the mountains, I would say, is changing. So keep that in mind if you run across that information. The other varieties, the general types of grapes that can be grown in our area, are American bunch grapes. And those are your standard table grapes that we all think about. Concord is probably one of the most well known. And then we have the wine grapes. There's European varieties, and then there are hybrid varieties. The hybrid varieties have more disease tolerance than the European varieties. There is a whole subset of information and growing techniques for wine grapes specifically that we won't have time to dive into. But just know that there are growers in our area that are growing wine grapes. There are growers, backyard growers, that are doing a variety of table grapes. And as I mentioned, some people that are now experimenting with muscadines as well. Because grapevines are really vigorous, oftentimes you really need to be more careful with how much fertilization you're putting down. The first year for most grapevines, you don't need to put any additional fertility down. And in subsequent years, once you start to see production, you're going to base your fertility on the level of fruit set, so that there's a fine balance there of not over fertilizing so that you're not wasting that material and not creating more growth that you're just going to have to prune off anyway. Like all of the other fruits that we mentioned, you do want to mulch them. You do want to make sure that they've got access to water, irrigation when they're doing fruit set, especially if you're doing wine grapes, because the infrastructure load and the cost to get those grapes in the ground is so high. You want to make sure you set them up for success. Grapes do have a number of diseases and insect pressures. There will be ways as a backyard gardener that you can minimize the amount of spraying that you might be doing. What that translates into is that you're going to need to make sure that you're really pruning heavily to make sure airflow and sunlight gets into that canopy and keeps disease pressure to a minimum. As I mentioned, you're going to have to get these vines up off the ground, and you can do that with beautiful trellises, arbors, or you can do more of the traditional grapevine trellis where you've got posts and high tensile wire. If you do the high tensile wire, you want to make sure you've got at least two heights of that wire so that you'll be training canes at a lower level, usually about 3 feet, and then a higher level that can be anywhere from 5 to 6 feet tall. And so that is how you're going to maintain that above ground growth of the grapevine. When you look at how to prune grapevines, and you absolutely have to prune grapevines every year, most of the pruning is going to be done in the dormant season. So generally in our area, we like to target January, February for that time frame. When you're talking about grapevines, you'll see cane pruning and spur pruning as the main types of pruning. If you really do a deep dive into grapes, you will find a number of different types of pruning systems. And there's not really one right or wrong way to do it. You just want to make sure that you are pruning every year and you're pruning in a way where you're allowing renewed growth to grow fruits for the next season and future canes that the fruits grow on to be produced. It can get very confusing. The picture that you see there below is a picture of cane pruning. These long horizontal laterals are the canes, and these are all the buds that will then send up growth once the season comes alive. And those will be where the fruit is born. So when you do cane pruning, you have to train these canes along that wire. And you also have to ensure that you're leaving some renewal spurs so that this piece right here, next growing season, will then be able to be the next year's fruiting cane. The spurs and the canes are just terms that you need to pay attention to. This is the main trunk of the grapevine. The different pruning systems that you see, the cane pruning here and the spur pruning that you see here, dictate where the renewal area of growth comes from. So when you're cane pruning, you're targeting those canes as the renewal portion of the plant. And spur pruning, rather than leaving these long canes, you're reducing them to these short little spurs. These spurs are where the new growth comes out of. You can really go with either of these pruning systems. There's a number of benefits and disadvantages to each. The cane pruning, you have to do less overall pruning, but you have to come back in and make sure that you're tying those canes to the wire. And so for a lot of people, it comes down to a labor decision. The recommendation is just to pick a method, pick a system, and stick with it. And to make sure that you're pruning every dormant season, every late winter. Don't be afraid to prune heavily because grapevines are really vigorous. And oftentimes you're pruning up to about 90% of that material out before the new season starts. So it can be quite dramatic a pruning for grapevines, but they will continue to thrive, do well, and produce when you do that adequate pruning. A quick note that there are lots of other fruits that you can grow in the backyard. Elderberry, hardy kiwis, goji berry. There are endless others. When you're growing in your backyard, you've got a lot of flexibility with what you might want to try. I would encourage you, if you've got the space, try to grow as many fruits as you can. That creates a more diverse habitat. You're going to bring in more natural predators and beneficial insects and pollinators. Elderberry is a really beautiful native plant that has medicinal value. It's a beautiful landscape plant as well. Some of these more alternative fruits that you see less promoted in the extension literature can certainly do well here. So don't feel like you're limited to the ones that we just covered in detail today. A quick note about harvesting. The rule of thumb is just to make sure you're out there harvesting regularly. So berries, you're going to be harvesting a few times a week at the height of the growing season when they're really being productive. Grapes, 1 to 2 times a season. Common sense things. Don't ideally harvest at the heat of the day. Don't wash your berries because that will quickly rot them and you'll lose a lot of quality and flavor if you do that. So just make sure you get out there in the morning, harvest your berries before all the other birds and voles and critters can get to them because you will be competing a little bit with some of these other animals as well. And just expect to have pest issues. Fruits are enticing for a number of different organisms. There's a lot of insect pests out there, and there's a fair amount of disease pressure depending upon the fruit type. My biggest recommendation is to just pay attention to the growth of your plants throughout the season so that if you start to see the berries looking distorted or you notice that something starts to look off color, or maybe you see a weird kind of growth on the underside of the leaves, pay attention to that and utilize our office. We've got some amazing volunteers that can help you ID things, and we can point you towards the right resources to figure out what the pest is and also steps that you can take. There's plenty of other ways to manage pests besides just spraying. So we're largely going to encourage you to do all those other things before you try to attempt any kind of spray for your insects or diseases. And just know that you can do everything right. You can plant the perfect varieties and still have odd years like we're having this year, where things warm up really quickly and then we get 20-degree temperatures or more. So even if you do everything right, Mother Nature has the last laugh. There's a number of different things that can influence how much fruit you're getting. If you've got adequate pollinator populations, if we have a really heavy, wet spring, oftentimes you can get poor fruit set just because the pollinators can't get out and fly around and pollinate as they normally would. So some years you're going to have better harvest than others, and just know that that's part of the fun of growing any living plant. The last slides here are resources that I recommend that go into much more detail than we could cover today about the different types of problems you might see with particular fruits. We've got some really good diagnostic tools through Cooperative Extension that are linked here. And then this next resource page, you can click on all of these to do a deep dive into these individual species and more. With that, I will open it up to questions. If we don't get to all of your questions, feel free to email me as well. My email up there on the screen is the best way to do that.
That's great, Megan. I'm glad at that last slide you showed the links because we were getting questions about goji berries and cornelian cherries and some of those other materials. One more about pruning grapes. Do you need to prune them during the growing season as well, or just during the winter?
Every pruning cut you make is a potential entry point for disease or insect issues. That's why we try to encourage people to prune all things, including grapes, in the dormant season when there's less activity, less disease spores roaming around. If you do see disease starting in your grapevines, then you'd want to cut that out as soon as you can, but try to do the bulk of your pruning in the dormant season.
Thank you so much, Megan, for joining us
Yeah,
today.
happy to do that. Please utilize all the resources and please take advantage of our spring plant sales and get out there and grow some fruits.
Yeah, absolutely. Please join us April 10th for Fruit Trees and Home Gardens with Craig Mauney. That was a reschedule from February. And also on April 20th, we'll be talking about colorful shade gardens beyond hostas with Deb Breck. Thank you so much and have a great day.